Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Midelis and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got a great program lined up for you today. In just a few moments, our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez is going to be leading a discussion with Amy Peikoff. She's a human rights lawyer and their discussion is going to be surrounding the Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights we all have here in the United States, but specifically in border zones as well as U.S. ports of entry. So I'm looking forward to that conversation coming up in just a bit. But first, as always, we're going to take a look at what's trending across the border, starting on the northern border today in Minnesota, where tensions are high in Minneapolis after a woman was killed by an ICE officer Wednesday during the immigration crackdown in their city. Her death was captured on cell phones and seen by millions online. Federal and local officials are at odds over what happened and why it happened. Usher Karashay is in Minnesota with the latest. Watch.
Protests this morning outside a federal building in Minneapolis, where residents are demanding justice after 37-year-old Renee Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent Wednesday.
Saw the video, I just totally thought it was murder, plain and simple.
That video shows Good backing up in her car as an agent tries to open the driver's side door. As she begins to pull away, another officer draws his gun and fires multiple rounds, killing her.
It was an act of domestic terrorism.
The Trump administration blames Good. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem claims Good had been stalking agents all day. State and local leaders say ICE should leave Minneapolis, and its presence is what led to the violence.
Do you have no decency? We have someone dead in their car for no reason whatsoever.
Federal and state investigators are now looking at the use of deadly force and whether it was warranted.
Someone is fleeing. That is not a justification for the use of deadly force.
Retired ICE agent Eric Ballier took a close look at the video evidence and says it's up to the officer to stay calm.
She's trying to get around that vehicle, is what it appears to me. She has the steering wheel turned to the right, and she's trying to get away. I hate to say it, but you have to tune out the noise. You have to focus on your objective.
Renee Nicole Good leaves behind a wife and 6-year-old child. Usher Qureshi, CBS News, Minneapolis.
Now, the Associated Press did speak with Good's mother, who said that she had not been involved in any protests against ICE during the federal immigration crackdown in Minneapolis. Now, as Usher reported this morning, dozens of people bundled up in heavy coats gathered in a parking lot near the federal building at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota. Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bovino showed up at that protest. There he is on your screen right there. The building houses several federal agencies, including an immigration court. The crowd was chanting and holding American flags and signs calling on ICE to leave the state of Minnesota. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said agents are not going anywhere. Similar protests were held throughout the country last night, including Los Angeles and New York City. As we told you earlier this week, 2,000 federal agents have descended on Minnesota in the latest federal immigration crackdown in the United States. Agents and officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement's deportation branch, as well as Homeland Security investigations, are in the Minneapolis area. The plan is for the area agents and officers to oversee a 30-day surge in operations in the Twin Cities area. Commander Bovino, who has overseen controversial immigration roundups in L.A., Chicago, Charlotte, and New Orleans, will be overseeing this operation as well. In other news, lawmakers in New Jersey are trying to pass bills on immigration enforcement. One piece of legislation would prohibit state, county, or local law enforcement officers from providing help to federal agents as they enforce federal civil immigration law. Another bill would require the state's attorney general to develop policies on how sensitive locations like schools, hospitals, shelters, and places of worship interact with federal civil law enforcement to ensure people aren't deterred from attending services in those specific areas. Time now to bring in our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez and our guest for today's program, Amy Peikoff. She is a attorney focused on civil rights, and we're talking Fourth Amendment today. Sandra?
Hi, Rudy. Welcome, Amy. Amy is a lawyer at the nonprofit Pacific Legal Foundation. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Sandy.
So you were a former professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy and Southwestern Law School. You founded and you were president of the Center for Legalization of Privacy, which filed an amicus brief in the famous U.S. versus Facebook case, which involved privacy rights of personal data on social media. So this is definitely your forte. Today we're talking about Fourth Amendment, like Rudy mentioned, search and seizure rights, and specifically in border zones and at U.S. ports of entry. So you recently co-authored a policy brief with your nonprofit, and it says more Americans are facing Fourth Amendment violations at the border. What search and seizure rights, why are they different, and what did you mean by that?
Well, so we have something that is known as a traditional border exception to the Fourth Amendment. As you know, the Fourth Amendment protects our persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But there has been a traditional border exception to this so that at border zones and ports of entry, the appropriate federal government personnel can inspect people who are coming into the United States for contraband, things that are subject to customs and duties, making sure that there isn't any smuggling of persons, right? Any human trafficking going on, bringing in contraband, weapons, et cetera. That's the purpose of this traditional exception. And what we have been putting our attention on at Pacific Legal Foundation recently is the fact that they have, we believe, unjustifiably extended this traditional border exception to cover the contents of Americans' personal electronic devices. So they are currently executing on policies that allow them to search without a warrant and without even any particularized suspicion the contents of your personal electronic devices. And we think that the Supreme Court should weigh in on this.
So now you mentioned ports of entry, obviously airports and land ports, but the border zone, are you talking 100-mile strip? What is the border zone and what does this pertain to?
So the border zone actually pertains to searches of vehicles, or it could be vessels, right, as well. It's the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1952 that authorizes these searches within a so-called reasonable distance to the border. And they have judged this for decades now to be 100 miles from any U.S. border, which includes all the coasts. Okay. And as you can see there in the graphic, right, that includes a lot of major cities of the United States. And in fact, about 2/3 of the U.S. population lives within this so-called border zone. And that means either at these permanent checkpoints that you sometimes see, for example, I used to live in Southern California, and I would frequently drive through the border zone the border checkpoint that is set up in between Los Angeles and San Diego on the 5 freeway. I would pass that all the time. And sometimes they would stop you, sometimes they wouldn't, but they are able to stop and search any vehicle at these set checkpoints within that border zone. And in fact, sometimes they can set up temporary checkpoints and do the same thing.
I read that there is a 2018 directive from CBP, Customs Border Protection, that requires them to have, quote, reasonable suspicion for the most intrusive searches of personal electronic devices. But Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, has a different standard. It allows them to conduct searches without any suspicion. Is that correct? What's happening here?
Yes, that is true. So it seems that if you are at a port of entry and there is an ICE agent who is involved in the search of your electronic devices, then that person is not covered by the CBP directive, which, as you read, purports to say that there at least must be reasonable suspicion before conducting the most intrusive searches. Those intrusive searches involve actually affixing electronic equipment, special equipment, to your device, and it can be used used, maybe there's an algorithm that it uses to scan the contents of your device, perhaps download the content of your device, and then they would later keep it, perhaps put it into a government database. A lot of times we're not sure what happens to the data that they will pull off these devices at these searches.
And what justifies, under what reasoning does the government have to conduct these searches? Is it for national security protection, suspicion of some illegal entry into the United States? What are the justifications?
Yeah, so they say that it just falls under the traditional border exception, that any property that a person is carrying over the border is subject to inspection. But traditionally, this exception extended to looking into luggage to make sure that you weren't carrying a weapon or that you weren't carrying certain types of drugs that are prohibited, some sorts of goods that might be subject to customs or duties. Maybe you're smuggling some jewelry in that really needs to be subject to customs taxes, right? This is the rationale for the traditional border search exception. And we believe, and we're joined by a number of scholars in this, that the digital contents of your electronic devices are not like those other types of property that could be, there's not a weapon smuggled in here. There's not drugs smuggled in here. There's not any sort of, customs or dutiable items smuggled in here.
We're speaking with Amy Peikoff. She is a human rights lawyer with the Pacific Legal Foundation about the rights or lack of rights that were afforded within 100 miles of the border and at U.S. ports of entries under the Fourth Amendment. We're going to continue the conversation after a quick break, so stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Good afternoon and welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Joining me once again for this segment, our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez and our guest for today's program, human rights lawyer Amy Peikoff.
Amy, I want to jump right into something you mentioned right before the break about the 100-mile border zone. So right now where we are in Harlingen, Texas, we're less than 20 miles from the Mexican border, well inside the 100-mile zone. So can my phone be searched because I'm in this zone, or my device is searched at any time?
So I'm not aware. Yeah, I'm not aware of these device searches that we've described as being conducted anywhere within the border zone. This is happening in ports of entry, and I think primarily the CBP is conducting these. Although, as I said, when you read the directives provide for a handoff to ICE personnel who are governed by a lower standard of proof. But as I said, I think these are all occurring primarily at ports of entry, not just anywhere in the border zone. The border zone searches involve searches of your vehicles and your persons within that zone at checkpoints.
Okay. And certainly if there is suspicion and there are arrests or encounters of people that are believed to be crossing in from Mexico illegally here, then that would probably, their devices would probably be confiscated at that time.
Certainly they could be, depending. Now, if you have citizens who raise some suspicion and are arrested within the border, there's actually a Supreme Court case that says for any U.S. citizen who is arrested, the traditional search incident to arrest exception does not apply to the contents of electronic devices. Even if you're arrested, the government is supposed to get a warrant. And this is the rationale on which we think the border search exception also should not apply to the contents of devices, that the government should get a warrant.
Well, your report says since 2015, the number of warrantless searches has quadrupled to over 46,000 in 2024. That's a phenomenal number.
Yes, and as I understand, in the next fiscal year, the 2025, it's up over 55,000 now.
And 78% of electronic devices searched at the border in 2024 belong to non-citizens, about 36,000. So that kind of go hand in hand with perhaps encounters by Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection officials that like we're talking about.
Sure. And I mean, one thing that's important to note is that the rights that American citizens have with respect to the demands for the search of the devices vary in a certain way from non-citizens. If non-citizens refuse to allow the device search, they can actually be excluded from entry to the United States. If you're an American citizen returning from a trip abroad, for example, if you refuse to allow them to search your device, you cannot be denied entry, but they can retain your device for a search for a certain period of time per the directive.
So what do you say to someone who says, I don't want my device searched? I mean, what is your suggestion?
Well, I mean, all the advice that is out there, and of course, I can't give legal advice to anybody
You don't
as
want to
their
get
attorney.
sued,
So
right?
there's my disclaimer. But there's a lot of advice being given out these days because a lot of people are very concerned about this. So I've seen wonderful write-ups in Wired magazine, ACLU offers it, et cetera. What I can tell you is that according to current law, if a CBP or ICE officer at a port of entry demands your cell phone and demands the passwords, the current law says that you are obligated to hand it over. And that's exactly why we have filed the suit that we have at Pacific Legal Foundation to try to change that law. Now, given that that's the case, there's a lot of advice that's being circulated around having to do with what we would call traveling light as you go across the border, meaning that maybe you are carrying what a lot of people think of as a burner device. You know, people talk about burner cell phones. They're not just for criminals now, right? So there are people who are just don't want a CBP officer rifling through their personal family photos, for example, that are on their cell phone. We've heard stories of this happening, and we've heard stories of CBP officers making interesting comments, let us say, about the contents. This is something that you might want to avoid. And if you do, what you would do is maybe carry a burner device. Some people are doing things like they would back up their device into some sort of encrypted cloud file before they ever go into any airport or near a port of entry. And then perhaps they would put their phone into a different mode so that it can't access all of the information that's up on the cloud at all. So by combinations of different passwords, using encrypted cloud-based storage, because one thing that's important to note is that their directive does not allow them to use your device to access information that you have stored in the cloud. So if you do things like make difficult passwords to get any cloud access, if you do things like, really just make sure that you can't access that, that information from your device. You could put it in airplane mode as one way of doing that as well. Turn off your device before you ever start going through the customs checks, et cetera. There are things, like I said, that you can do to try to minimize the risk. But the reality is, until the law changes, you are obligated to hand it over. And even if you don't, they can confiscate the device and do their best to get the data off it outside your presence.
Okay, so let me back up because you said a couple of really interesting things, and that was great advice. So if you turn your phone off, they can't require you to turn it back on and give them the password? I mean, you just give them...
They can, but this is the thing. So suppose you decided that you did not want to comply. And in fact, our plaintiff in the case, Wilmer Chavarria.
And tell us about the lawsuit. Tell us about the lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Wilmer Chavarria in July of 2024 was entering through the Houston airport. He was returning on a trip from Nicaragua, and he had visited his family. He just thought he would be going through. He had, global entry card even. And suddenly he finds himself being taken to this back room in the airport, the Bush airport there in Houston Intercontinental. And they demand his devices and his passwords. And Wilmer believed that as a U.S. citizen, he had Fourth Amendment rights that allowed him to refuse warrantless searches of his electronic devices. And he was mocked. He was said that he was behaving suspiciously for asserting such rights, et cetera. They ended up detaining him for between 4 and 5 hours until he finally relented upon certain promises that they gave him not to access professional data that was on at least one of the devices. And they did end up searching his devices. But one option that he could have exercised would have been to not give them any passwords, in which case their directive says that they can retain his devices, but they have to allow him to enter the country. And then they would later send back the devices after they use whatever forensic equipment and methods that they have available to search the devices, potentially pull data off the devices, et cetera. Now, again, if you set up strong encryption on your devices, you're going to make it that much more difficult for a government to be able to access them without a warrant. If they would present you with a warrant, then I think properly you should have to unlock and show them. But a warrant would mean probable cause and particularized suspicion that they have reason to think that there's some evidence of a crime on your device. And right now, what they're doing is they're going on phishing expeditions all through Americans' devices.
Now, your client, as I understand it, is a superintendent in Vermont. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And the lawsuit currently is in D.C. federal court.
That's correct.
Yeah.
District of D.C.
Okay. And I mean, you mentioned as this relates to the Fourth Amendment. Well, we think about when the Fourth Amendment was made hundreds of years ago, right? And so and now we are in this era of technology and AI and constantly advancing. How do you justify? How do you get this, up to date with what's really happening in society? Is it going to be through the courts?
Yes, I think the courts really are the best way to test the application of the border exception to the contents of these electronic devices. Reason being in this is that Riley versus California is a U.S. Supreme Court case that has a rationale that would not extend this exception to those devices, just as they did not extend the search incident to arrest exception to these devices. If, arrestees who are actually guilty of some sort of crime have a lot of privacy in these devices, we think any innocent person who's coming through a port of entry should have the same rights.
We've been speaking with Amy Peikoff. She's a human rights lawyer with the Pacific Legal Foundation about what rights we do and apparently don't have when it comes to the Fourth Amendment among border zones and at U.S. ports of entry across the country. It's almost a crime that we only get 30 minutes to discuss such an important amendment in our Constitution, but we appreciate you being here today, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. They can find more more information at pacificlegal.org.
Yeah, and we'll also have a link to that lawsuit that you were just talking about on borderreport.com. So if you're interested in checking out more about that, make sure to visit borderreport.com a little later today. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Midelis, your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of Deep South Texas. Got a few more headlines to share with you this afternoon. In other border news, U.S. transportation officials have announced that California will lose $160 million for delaying the revocations of 17,000 commercial driver's licenses for immigrants. The state notified those drivers in the fall that they would lose their licenses after a federal audit found problems, including licenses for truckers and bus drivers that remained valid long after an immigrant's visa expired. But then last week, California said it would delay those revocations until March after immigrant groups sued the state because of concerns that some groups were being unfairly targeted. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said the state was supposed to revoke those licenses by Monday. Also happening in California, the Los Angeles School District says this year it has lost more than 13,000 immigrant students, mostly Hispanic, because of the stepped-up federal immigration raids in Southern California. For years, schools have been seeing a decrease in enrollment because of the cost of living and falling birth rates. But according to the 74, a nonprofit website that covers education in America, this year's decreases are attributed to the raids. A parents' advocacy group says some children chose not to go back to school because they know some immigrant parents and children have been arrested or detained by ICE. The LA School District is the second largest and serves more than 500,000 students. School districts in Denver, Miami, and San Diego also attribute a loss of enrollment to the ICE raids. And one last story to tell you about. Prosecutors are accusing an Arizona man of selling a rifle and 17 unregistered machine gun conversion devices to a federal informant. That's a look at them on your screen right there. The charges were filed Monday against Jose Francisco Rondon in U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona and reflect a stepped-up federal offensive against distributors of small, simple-looking devices that can turn a semi-automatic gun or rifle into a lethal rapid-fire killing machine. Court records show Rondon has been charged with selling 18 firearms without a license and possessing 17 unregistered machine guns. He faces a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison if he is convicted of those crimes. Before we go, we wanted to remind you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. Political Power Ranker is a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Nextstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data. This week, they're focusing on the Senate races and governor's race in Illinois. Next week, they're coming down here to Texas. So if you want to learn more about Political Power Ranker, visit abc27.com or your local Nexstar station's website. That's going to do it for us today. For Sandra Sanchez here in South Texas, my name's Rudy Midelis in Harlingen. We'll see you next time.